Good morning, everyone. Terribly sorry, I was in the middle of a brief, important conversation. So of late we've been looking... Oh, hello. Hello, Audrey. How are you? I haven't said good morning to you this morning. Are you well? Of late we've been looking at some spiritual disciplines. These are the ways that we can grow spiritually. And it's just been such a great privilege to be able to just remind us of these simple practices that Jesus practiced that helped him grow from a child who was born like us, knowing nothing, to grow to the point where he could trust God even unto the cross. These are the ways that help us grow in godliness, to borrow the words of the Apostle Paul, which he said to his disciple Timothy, his young apprentice. And these are some of the ways that have been tried and tested throughout the last 2,000 years by the Christian church and have helped Christians throughout the ages know and grow in God. They're not things that we're obliged to do, but they are things that help us grow. And it's been great to be able to share some of these tools with you so that we can be the strongest in Christ that we can be. And so we looked at the disciplines of abstinence, which are the things that we refrain from. And these are really powerful for breaking bad habits and patterns of thinking that we just seem to just pick up by default in this world. And some of the really powerful ones that we should practice regularly are things like silence and solitude, just being quiet and alone with God. They include fasting, the ability to just cut things out and depend on God all the more. And these are just some of the ways that we can step back from being shaped and defined by this world and by the existence that we're part of and actually encounter God. And the amazing thing is, when we step back, we find God in the silence, and we have that space to actually consider and think and reflect and choose who we will be. And of course, there are the disciplines of engagement, things like prayer and Bible study and worship, which are actively participating in the kingdom of God. These are ways that we live as Christ's disciples and engage in him and invite him to shape and define us. But there's one discipline which is not on a lot of the lists. It's a strange omission. And it's the one I want to focus on today because I think this is the single discipline which helps us to have the greatest spiritual formation, to have the greatest transformation, to be like Christ. I think this is the best way to facilitate growth. And I think some lists leave it off because it can be confused as just being part of our obligation as disciples, I guess. But it's definitely a discipline because when we practice this, we become more like Christ. We grow in faith, but by indirect means. So by definition, a discipline, and something that we must choose and persist in. I talk about proclamation or witnessing. To proclaim is to speak of and to share the person of Jesus Christ and his gospel. And of course, evangelism is core to what we are. But it's also a very, very powerful discipline. Proclamation, evangelism, probably the same thing effectively, but I like the term proclamation better in this case because when we talk of evangelism, we think about programs and formality and doing things together, and that's really important, and that's a great way to grow. And when we do this, we are proclaiming Christ, but at the same time, proclamation happens when I sit next to someone on a bus or when I talk to somebody over lunch at church. Proclamation is just that average, everyday sharing of the things that matter to me as Christ. and to share the joy that we find in him. It really is the pleasure of the disciple to be able to share Jesus with the people that matter to them particularly, and with everyone really. But there's something really curious about this. When I proclaim Jesus, when I talk about him, when I tell other people about him, whether inside the church or out, my faith grows. My confidence in him increases. I'm more aware of who he is and of what he is doing in my life. Because to share something, I have to think about it and I have to reflect and I have to formulate ideas. And as I think about Jesus and I think about what is relevant to the person sitting next to me, this helps formulate my ideas and grow my faith and my trust in him. The awareness makes me more perceptive of what God is doing, and I see his action and his work in my life all the more. My faith and my trust in him grows. Sharing grows you and your faith in powerful ways and has a great impact on your listening, God willing. It's well known when we argue about anything with anyone else, which we should be very careful about doing when discussing God because it's usually not helpful. We usually only entrench one another in our own perspective. We really only reinforce what we already believe. And of course, this is true when we're sharing Jesus. We are all the more assured in what we already believe. And so as we share him, we grow in that confidence and we grow in that awareness. So I guess my question is, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to proclaim Christ? Why is it so hard to talk about him with others? Why do we always find it a little bit of an uphill struggle? And I think it's worth acknowledging this. Because this is the very reason God left his church on earth. We could just immediately be flitted up to heaven the second we convert. But we're left here for a reason. And a key part of that is to bring life to others. So why is this so hard to do? Well, there are a few reasons that I can think of, and I'm sure there's a million more. I think fear is probably the first one that we really should acknowledge, because we're not sure what's going to happen. And we're not sure if people are going to accept what we value. And we're not sure if it's going to affect the relationship. And I think this is closely connected with hurt, because sometimes the motives behind sharing might have been misjudged or may have been criticised, and perhaps there has been hurt as a relationship has changed, perhaps as a result of the best intentions one might have. And then, of course, there's frustration and maybe even anger. I think some perhaps are frustrated that the kingdom is not going ahead the way we would like to see. It isn't going ahead the way that perhaps God promises it might. And maybe there's even jealousy that for some people it seems so easy, whereas for others perhaps it's such a slog. And of course there's the scandal that some people might be saved who we really think might deserve to be lost. The Hitler types. Jonah was scandalised at the idea that the Ninevites, horrible people, might be saved. And I think deep down some of us shared this idea. And so fear, hurt, frustration, they're natural, they're valid. We respond this way to different situations, to challenges, real or imagined. And that's fair. That's what feelings do. They help us understand what we value and they help keep us safe. But God gives us a way to overcome this. Because we shouldn't deny our feelings, but when we acknowledge them, we then have a choice. And God enables us to have the faith to push through and to overcome. And then, of course, there are some that are too busy, whether through just overwhelming life or because, well, let's be honest, some are just greedy and selfish. And we're probably all somewhere between the two, in which case the love of God is what we really need to motivate us to take that extra moment to bring Christ to someone. And I think sometimes we've allowed our Advent framework perhaps to discourage us a little bit. And what I mean by that is I think sometimes we are too focused on obedience and not focused enough on the love of God. And if that happens, I don't think there's a joy and there's a passion for God. And it can just become a framework. And if that's the case, the question then has to be asked, do you actually believe that's the best thing for your neighbour? I've heard this questioned by well-meaning people who have missed Jesus for the religion. And if that's the case, we need to refocus ourselves on Jesus. And in this case, we don't need God's love for them. We need to encounter God's love for us. Because until you believe this is the best possible thing in the world for you, why ever would you share it? And in that case, please ask a godly person, have conversations, prayer, discussion, find someone to disciple you. Let people know maybe I haven't seen God the way I need to. Because God promises when you seek him, you will find him. So seek him, spend time in prayer, spend time in study. Look for Jesus, the person, the one who loves you enough to step into your space, your time, to die in your place. Because when this happens, we miss the fact that salvation is not an act of knowledge. Salvation is God relating to you in love. The gospel really, it's not a hard thing. It's simply this. God created people just like himself to be his children, his family in a perfect world. Yeah, that's easy. But people rejected God, instead believing God's enemy and wading into a cosmic conflict that was none of their business and which God told us to stay out of. And so we made ourselves collateral as we sided with God's enemy. This choice corrupted our world, and we started making choices that were motivated by selfishness and ultimately hurting one another. Because any motivation other than love is what we call sin. It's a virus that destroys and corrupts and kills people and destroys our environment through greed and exploitation. But God never stopped being motivated by love. Jesus came to earth to show us his love, to show us how to live the love of God both for us and towards one another. So we can now live lives of love even in a sinful world, and that is the gospel. This gospel says that God's going to do two things for us. First, he's going to transform us back into that image and likeness of Christ, bit by bit, removing the corrupting sin in our lives. So we are no longer agents of destruction, but rather of love, and we partner with God in this work. But more importantly, that God will reconnect us to himself, the author and sustainer of life, so we can have life in his presence now and for eternity in a world made new without suffering. But lastly, the gospel states that those who wish to be outside of God are allowed to make that choice, but that they're living off the residual life that God gave them and that it will wind down and cease to exist. The choice is ours. I mean, that's the gospel in a nutshell. We are invited to be with and like God, or we are empowered to make any other choice that we want. But we need to know that without God, there is no life. But God has come to us in love to restore us to himself. That is the gospel, the joy of God, the love of God that leads to a life lived the way that God tells us best. There's a lot of reasons why we might not share God. There's many more. We know that there's an enemy that's not real keen on this going ahead and he's going to make life hard. There's so many more reasons why we might be hesitant to share who Jesus is with a person or people that we encounter. I'm not about to criticise any. We're all human. We're all growing bit by bit. But when we share our faith with those around us, our faith grows in remarkable ways and we give them a chance at life to see and know God. But I want to change tack, and this is actually where I want to really spend most of my time this morning. Yeah, I've still got plenty of time. I want to suggest or invite you to consider something a little bit different in the way we proclaim Jesus. We noted earlier that when we argue, we tend to just reinforce one another's idea. It really doesn't tend to serve us very well. When we engage with others, we want to do so in a way that opens their thinking, not closes it. And someone who did that incredibly well, of course, was Jesus. So, how did Jesus interact with people that perhaps weren't on track? He had one very clever and very powerful tool. He would ask a question. Luke 10 records a conversation, a question asked of Jesus. Teacher, what must I do? Hey Samuel, how are you? Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now, we can all imagine what would have happened if he'd asked an Adventist this question. Boy, wouldn't we have had something to tell him? But Jesus simply asks him a question. What does your Bible say? What's written in Scriptures? What's written in the law? Because he already knew the answer to that question. In this case, he was playing a game. And Jesus' questions turned things back to focus on him. Where was his heart and his head at? What were his motives and his priorities? Now, of course, the man seeks to justify himself. He knew the answer, he gave the answer, but he asked, well, then who is my neighbour? And of course, this gives us this beautiful story of the Good Samaritan, which Jesus tells. But notice the point of Jesus' illustration. He sets the stage for another question. Who then was a neighbour? And that question shone a spotlight right into his heart, revealing his pride, his superiority, and the toxicity of the way that he went about life and spirituality. This was the genius of Jesus. Because sharing Jesus is not so much about what you know, but about how much they know and helping them to take the next step. Jesus took this man on the next step. He took this man places he had no intention of ever going. But in doing so, he opened the door to life if this man was willing to choose it. So questions are just brilliant. When I give you all the best arguments in the world, it's seen as a sales pitch. And what happens then? Your brain switches off, you disengage, or alternatively, it might be seen as a debate, and then your competitive side kicks in, and if you're winning, you get arrogant. If you're losing, you get angry. It's human. We all do it. It's his life. But if someone's curious, if someone asks you a question and then actually listens to you, you're going to engage, aren't you? Because we feel special. And if it's a good question, they might even lead you to be motivated in examining your own motives and your own beliefs before you even realise. For example, a common sentiment that you'll hear in the world today is that all religions are the same and all are good if they're used properly. Is there more of a red rag to a bull for Adventists than that? Because we have a million reasons why they're not all equal, why Jesus is the only way, and then with obedience to the law and observing the Sabbath. It's the truth, we have it, you need it, yes? But is it helpful? And if people make a statement like that, are they actually looking for information? Or is it apathy or a brush off or maybe even an attack? And all the best information in the world probably won't make much of a difference unless they actually are genuinely interested. And really, why should we go on the defensive anyway? Perhaps a simple response of, really? As unsarcastically and as genuinely as possible might actually be a good approach. Maybe you could ask, so what do you think that core teaching is at the heart of all religions? Because obviously they're suggesting there is one, and if they think there is one, maybe that would be a good thing to explore. And the goal is not to make them look silly, but the goal is to try and explore what they think and why they're going the way they're going. Because what they answer is going to tell you about their values, about their beliefs. And their values and their beliefs are their obstacles to faith. If we want someone to know Jesus, we need to know what they believe so that we can interact with those. Because that is the starting place. And it's going to reveal their values, their priorities, and probably their wounding. And if you show a genuine interest and listen, you might be surprised how close to their heart you get, and you may even gain the privilege of speaking to their heart. They may give you a very simplistic concept of religion. For example, religion exists to help people accept one another and to help you in death, hypothetically. You could ask them, is that what you think? Or is that what they actually teach? Do you know this? Or is this what you think it should be? Remembering they probably haven't thought about religion this much for their entire life. So be gentle, be kind. Because the further you go, the more desperate and flawed their answers will probably get. Or if they're already disengaging, you could have just agreed with them and say, look, my faith certainly does help me value one another, and it gives me incredible hope. But it means more to me than that. It's actually a lot richer and deeper, and I'd love to share it with you sometime if you would like. And always leave them wanting more, not less. Alternatively, you could acknowledge if religion is meant to help people be kind and accepting and, to give hope in death, historically, religion hasn't done a very good job, has it? That must really upset you. Imagine how strong a response you're going to get to that question. Because probably they're going to tell you all the ways that it has failed, and they are absolutely right. But of course, this opens the door for you to be able to say, well, both religion and non-religious people have done horrible things historically. Perhaps there's something in humans that isn't working very well. Do you think religion might be intended to speak to that? Because there's no point saying to them that all have sinned, but God gives us life, because we no longer live in a Christian world and people don't actually know what Christianity teaches. So maybe opening doors and curiosity to be able to share what Jesus actually even says he is here for is worth doing. We have to allow the groundwork to be built before we can start saying that Jesus is the answer, because they don't actually know what the question is anymore. There's no point saying all have sinned. Sin means nothing to them. So we need to break down our teaching, and if we can ask them questions and just give these little bits of answers as they share their ideas, it would be helpful. You could go on and say, well, I wonder where that selfish tendency comes from. Do you have any ideas? Because we love to jump in with information, don't we? We love to push the conversation in the direction that we think it should go. But imagine if you guided the conversation with good questions. Remember, when someone asks you for your thoughts and your ideas, even if they are skillfully guiding the conversation, you still feel special because they're interested in you. They're asking your opinion, they're listening. This is how Jesus shared God, and this is how we should share. And of course, once you've heard someone on a point, you've actually earned the right to give it your own opinion, although not too long and always with the focus still on them. The goal here is to make conversations about God so respectful that God joins the list of approved topics with this person. Yeah? Most people you talk to, you drop God, and it's not an approved topic, and they'll take exception. The goal is to be able to talk to them about God again. The goal is to stop sooner rather than later, so that they know that if this topic is brought up, that you're actually going to respect them in it. You want to be able to discuss this again. You want God on the list of approved topics. There's a reason for this. Conversion, by definition, is a changing of one's deepest values and one's worldview. This doesn't happen quickly without doing violence to someone. This is the core of their entire identity that we're talking about changing. When did we get the idea we could do that in one conversation? And so we steamroll them with this incredible bombardment. You cannot change that fast, with very few exceptions, without spiritually abusing them. We want to be able to walk with them, to be able to ask good questions, to be able to touch on this topic, to be able to give them some thought-provoking questions or ideas, and to leave them to chew and process and come back to it later, and then perhaps find a little bit more information, a little bit more of a inquiring question, so that over time we can walk with them, discussing our worldviews, what matters most, in a two-way conversation that helps guide them in the direction of who God is. We call this discipleship. It's discipleship. We don't just disciple people that know Jesus, we just disciple everybody. Baptism happens halfway along the journey. But discipleship is simply this journey of walking with people, reflecting, provoking thought, giving insights, listening, lovingly walking with them, experiencing and exploring the meaning of life together, and to invite them on how well their worldview is actually serving them. And of course, sharing the meaning that we have and the comfort that we find in Jesus Christ in our worldview as relevant to both of you as you both experience life. Remember the rich young ruler. Fantastic conversation. Where does Jesus lead that young man to? He simply brings him to the insight that his true God over God himself is his wealth. You've broken the first commandment. You're not all you think you are. You have a God before me. Jesus brings him to the point where he sees he has a need of God, that he has an idol standing in the way, and then Jesus says, "Come and follow me. Let me journey with and disciple you." One obstacle at a time, one discovery at a time, one challenge at a time. Then let's walk together and discover more of how God applies to our lives. It's called discipleship. We do our hearer a disservice when we say too much or too little. We do them a disservice when we try and convert them on the spot or say nothing at all. We need to walk with people gently and kindly, allowing them time to process and reflect and chew on things, and letting them get a word in edgewise occasionally. They need time. See, proclamation is not a sermon. It's a common exploration of the meaning of life and the worldviews by which we understand life with someone who you respect and who respects you. It's a two-way exchange. It's a conversation, a potentially life-changing conversation that takes place over the course of days and weeks and months and even years. It's to understand one another, to help reflect on what each other says in a way that draws out the deeper meaning and value of life. We help each other try on different ideas and explore different concepts. That's what a conversation does. It brings insight. And don't be afraid to openly engage with their thoughts as well. You're not going to be corrupted by their ideas, and Adventism is a really robust belief system. You don't have to worry. It will stand up to scrutiny. And the slightest hint of a misconstrued idea on their part is not going to drag you down. When we explore and help someone, they make their own discovery. And when they discover it themselves, as you guide them and ask questions, they will never forget it because they own that discovery. You didn't just give it to them, they discovered it, and so it has greater value. And of course, they feel valued and heard and safe. You cannot make serious change in your life unless you feel safe. So when we share, we must take the time to hear them, to make them feel valued, and to make them feel safe. There can be no deeper change. Doesn't matter. We need to stop pretending that we can change people by simply bombarding them with information. There was a time when people would change their minds when there were facts that were irrefutable. That time is gone. Information is now relative. We can't take shortcuts. The tools for proclamation today are simple: love, respect, listening, and time. The gift of time. We have to play the long game, walking together in a loving relationship, living discipleship with another person as they start to catch glimpses of Jesus, as they start to develop a worldview that might include Jesus, as they begin to perhaps choose to one day even be defined by him and to then live by his values and by his teachings. This is what Matthew 28 says. Go to all the world and make disciples. Not preach at, make disciples. Walk with them. Take the time to love them and invest in them, helping them see Jesus, helping them understand the world from Jesus' perspective, and ultimately helping them to trust in Jesus to the point of living his teachings. God will lead the way. Jesus has given us this model. And bear in mind, even with people with a solid understanding of Torah, Jesus still took 3 years. It's going to take time. But the Holy Spirit will go before you and will teach you how to do this, how to love, how to empathize, how to explore another's world through conversation, how to ask good questions, and when and what to share. But this is a spiritual discipline. We must choose to do so. We must intend to walk with others. We must persist in our choice, because it will take persistence to keep choosing it, because it is not the path of least resistance. But God will sustain us with his love for us, with his love for others, and with faith. God will grow us and transform us in the process. And as we do, he will start to transform those around us as well. So I want you to consider, who might you sit with this week? Who will you listen to this week? When you do, pray. Offer the conversation to God as a spiritual sacrifice, inviting him to shape and to guide it, asking him to make this conversation life-giving. Ask questions to explore their values and their beliefs. Listen to actually hear them, not to argue. And when you share the difference God has made in your life today, in the everyday things that you both have in common, the things that are relevant to their experience, so they can try on God, so to speak. Then tell me how it goes. Tell all of us how it goes, so we can encourage one another and spur each other on in doing what God has asked us to do. I pray that God can bless you richly and bless your efforts as you proclaim him with those that you encounter this week.